Hello everybody and welcome back to Vehicles of War Thunder. In this episode we'll be covering another American vehicle, but this time one that never actually saw combat and of which only a few were ever produced. Relatively speaking to other vehicles, of course. That vehicle is the M6 heavy tank, or as the variant that is available in War Thunder is called, the M6A1 heavy tank. As a quick reminder, because this is a very important detail for many of the tanks that we will be covering throughout this series, particularly these early vehicles, after the First World War, tank design saw a shift from the lozenge-shaped behemoths of World War I to faster, lighter, and turreted designs such as the French FT-17. This resulted in tanks evolving distinct classifications of light, medium, and heavy, the latter of which many tanks adopted the concept of a battleship on land, you might even call it a land ship, of massive tracked vehicles with a dozen crew and multiple turrets to counter any potential opposition. In the United States, tank development progressed at a slower pace than in Europe, at least until another major war broke out in Europe, showcased that the United States needed to prepare for possible involvement on a modern battlefield. With wars breaking out in Europe and Asia, the British and Soviet Union began developing newer tank designs that resulted in the British A1E1 independent heavy tank and the Soviet T-35. Both of which were multi-turreted heavy tanks, a design that quickly became unpopular, however, due to the financial and maintenance commitments required, the sheer weight and size of the designs, and the problematic command of such large crews. This resulted in many tanks preferring to stick with light and medium tank designs, and the use of armored warfare doctrines that preferred to overwhelm the enemy using speed and tactics. The United States, however, was a bit slow to get the memo and decided to stick with the heavy multi-turret tank design concept for a bit longer, resulting in the heavy tank T1. The design of the T1 called for a tank with a weight of around 50 tons and two primary turrets, each with a 75mm main gun. There was also to be a secondary armament of an additional turret with a 37mm gun with a 30 caliber coaxial machine gun, a tertiary armament with a fourth turret housing a 20mm cannon with its own 30 caliber machine gun. Finally, there were to be four 30 caliber machine guns around the hull to defend the tank from infantry attack. This initiative, however, did not actually begin until May of 1940 and was approved by the US Army the following month. However, by the end of 1940, the United States had witnessed enough modern combat in Europe between Britain and France against Germany that they now realized the multi-turret heavy tank concept was officially dead. As a result, the concept of the T1 heavy tank was revised to center around a single turret with a 76mm cannon and a 37mm cannon fitted as a coaxial mounting, and various calibers of machine guns. The tank's crew complement was reduced to 6 people. The crew consisted of a primary driver seated at the front left of the hull, an assistant driver / bow gunner to his right who would operate two 50 caliber machine guns in the front hull. Then there's the commander who could use a 30 caliber machine gun fitted to the cupola. 2 loaders, one of whom could use an optional single 50 caliber heavy machine gun mounted at the rear of the rooftop, and finally a gunner. This tank used a conventional design with the crew and turret fitted forward of the center line of the tank and with the engine in the rear. The suspension for the tank was a standard vertical volute spring suspension VVSS with 4 bogies per side, but the tracks were double the usual width and with 2 rubber shoes instead of 1. The upper tracks repose on a guide rail, and the entire side was protected by a large one-piece side skirt. Armor of the tank ranged from 44mm on the upper sides to 70mm on the lower sides, and 83mm on the turret. Because the tank was over 50 tons, the question became, how do you power such a heavy tank? The answer was to use the Wright G20 air-cooled radial gasoline engine, which developed 825 horsepower at 2300 RPM. As for the transmission, 3 prototypes were ordered. One was an electric transmission, one was a hydromatic transmission, and one with a torque converter. The firm charged with making these prototypes was Baldwin Locomotive Works, based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. On top of being charged with producing prototypes with different transmissions, they were also charged with making versions with different hull construction practices. At this point, the U.S. Army formally designated the line as the M6, and this produced the M6, aka the T1E2, the M6A1, the T1E3, and the M6A2, the T1E1 prototypes. Both the M6 and M6A1 used a torque converter transmission, while the M6 used a cast hull, and the M6A1 used a welded hull. The M6A2 used a cast hull and electric transmission. The original T1 vehicle with a cast hull and hydromatic transmission was never produced. The same happened with its sibling, the T1E4, which used the same transmission but with a welded hull. Baldwin produced these pilot vehicles from 1941 to 1942, and beginning in December of 1942, the US government placed a serial production order because by this time the United States was fully committed to the war in Europe while containing Japan in the Pacific. However, with the war in Europe advancing quickly, it was soon realized that the M6 heavy tank was a luxury program with limited scope. By this time, the US Army was getting large numbers of M4 Shermans, enough to be used as part of Lend-Lease programs with the other Allied powers, and was proving itself to be adequate against both the weaker Japanese tanks and the more expensive and technologically advanced German tanks. This results in the M6 falling out of favor in the US Army. All wasn't lost, however. Rewinding back to August 1944, it had been believed by some that the US would need heavily armored and armed vehicles to take on fortifications and enemy vehicles that would be encountered during the advance in Europe. The heavy tank M6 was chosen to accomplish this role over the T-29 because the T-29 was still in early development and would likely not enter service before the Western Allies encountered the heavier fortifications. It was decided by the Ordnance Corps that the M6 they had left over could be modified to meet these needs. These modified tanks were to be equipped with the T-29 turret and have their armor increased. To allow for the larger turret, the M6's turret ring would need to be expanded. As for the armor, to enable the increase, it was decided to remove the driver's vision door, along with the whole machine gun, and weld on additional armor to achieve an effective thickness of 190.5 millimeters. All of my sources claim that no tank actually received the additional armor package. On August 14, 1944, a tentative Ordnance Committee Minute, OCM, was written up and called for a total of 15 T1E1 M6A2 tanks to be modified, with the 5 remaining ones being used for spare parts. Army ground forces, who were excited by the idea of the tank and the project from the start, sent a message to General Eisenhower on the matter on August 2, 1944, before the OCM was actually written. Eisenhower responded on the 18th that the tank was not allowed or was not wanted, as they were deemed impractical for use, effectively killing this project, but not all heavy tank development. However, Eisenhower may not have been wrong, as a M6A2 loaded to the expected weight of 77 tons showed that it would had poor climbing abilities, being unable to climb on a slope of more than 22 degrees inclination. Because there wasn't enough time to change the drive gear reduction, the M6A2E1, as the tank would have been designated, would have been severely limited in what terrain it could operate on. Even though the project for the M6A2E1 was cancelled, it was requested that 2 still be finished to test the turret and armament of what would be used on the T-29. The request was granted, and 3 turrets were built by the Continental Foundry and Machine Company. 2 of the turrets were mounted on modified M6A2s and tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, with the 3rd turret being sent for ballistic testing at Watertown Arsenal, Massachusetts. Only 40 units of the various variants of this tank would be produced, and none of which would ever see combat service. The breakdown of those 40 units is as follows: 8 M6s, 12 M6A1s, and the remaining 20 were M6A2s, 2 of which were equipped with the T5E1 105mm gun that would be used on the T-29. Further consideration of the M6 formally ended on December 14, 1944, and all but 1 of the 40 units produced were scrapped. I'm not sure where the lone survivor is now, on display, because my sources say it was on display at the US Army Ordnance Museum in Aberdeen, Maryland. However, in August 2009, they started moving their collection to the Training Support Facility at Fort Lee, Virginia, though it sounds like some items may have also been moved to a new National Armory and Cavalry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia. I didn't want to break the flow previously, so as for the speed and range of these vehicles, the M6 series of heavy tanks had a max range of 100 miles and a max speed on road of 22 miles. So 161 kilometers max range, 35 kilometers max speed on road. Now about how this vehicle performs in game. The M6A1 is a nice, well, not really, little tank. It sits as at a low enough battle rating and is a somewhat rare type of tank, having two guns that you can at times trick enemies into pushing you if you fire the smaller 37mm gun. It also has a fast reload for a tank at 5.9 seconds on the 76mm if you max out your loader's weapon reloading skill and ace the vehicle. It does, however, have one glaring downside that also exists on the M6A2E1, and that is that the hull cheeks are fairly easy to pen, especially if you get up tiered. And if an enemy fires a round with a decent amount of explosive filler especially, they have a good chance of causing an ammo rack kill because your ammo racks are right behind, or at least some of your ammo racks are right behind those hull cheeks. As for the M6A2E1, let's examine its armor protection compared to the rounds fired by some of the other nations that they are likely to face off against. All the ranges for this comparison are using the in-game protection analysis, which I realize sometimes is not the most accurate. With the distances set to 500 meters and being fired head-on into the M6A2E1. We will also only compare it to tanks that currently sit at about a 6.3 battle rating as of when I wrote the script. I have not double-checked that these vehicles have not had their BRs changed since I wrote this script, which came out before Direct Hit was released. I will also not mention the hull cheek vulnerability on every vehicle. Just know that if the tank in question is firing something other than high explosive, there's a fairly decent chance that they'll be able to pen the hull cheeks, even if I say it can't pen the M6A2E1 from the front. First up is the German Bulldog, which is actually a fairly common tank to face at about the 6.3 battle rating, and it's not able to pen the upper front plate or turret cheeks of the M6A2E1 from the front unless it uses APDS or Heat FS rounds. In the case of the APDS round, it can't pen the turret cheeks, but it can pen the upper front plate, though that won't do much damage on its own. If using Heat FS rather, it can pen the turret cheeks from the front, but because of the way Heat FS works, it will likely only take out one or two crew members if they get lucky. The German Ferdinand, using its AP-CBC round, is capable of penetrating the M6A2E1 directly from the front and has a decent chance of killing the entire crew from its explosive filler. Moving on to Soviet vehicles, first up is the regular T-44, which can only pen the M6A2E1 from the front in two spots. One is just above the gun mantlet, and which is unlikely to work because of the way volumetric shells work. The other vulnerability is the aforementioned hull cheeks. The upgraded T-44-122 has a much easier time being able to pen the upper front plate, but it still can't pen the turret cheeks, so a hull down position works well if you're dealing with a T-44-122. The SU-100P, ASU-85, and IS-2-1944 are all much the same as the T-44-122, being able to pen the upper front plate but not the turret cheeks. Moving on to British vehicles, there are two vehicles of the same BR as you, again as of when I wrote the script. The Ratel 90 and the Charioteer Mark 7. For the Ratel, its primary round of Heat FS is very similar to the German Bulldog, allowing it to pen your upper front plate and turret cheeks. As for the Charioteer, both its AP rounds can pen your upper front plate, with the APDS also being able to pen your turret cheeks. Neither of these rounds is likely to knock out an M6A2E1 unless they get lucky and the round causes an ammo rack, which is a little bit less likely because those rounds don't have explosive filler. But it's technically still possible for solid shots to cause a ammo rack, just not super likely. As for Japan, with their STA-1 and STA-2, the APBC and APCBC rounds can only pen the hull cheeks from the front, and the APCBC has explosive filler, so it's likely to cause an ammo rack. As for the APCR and Heat FS rounds, the APCR can pen the upper front plate, but likely won't cause significant damage because of the way APCR works in game, which to my understanding is not quite 100% realistic. Generally, the APCR in game seems to lack some of the additional spalling and shrapneling that should happen realistically, but doesn't. Where was I? Yes, and the Heat FS can only pen the turret cheeks. We will skip the Type 95 SPH because it's the Type 95 SPH. For the Hori prototype, its APHE round can only pen the hull cheeks. That is going to be it for this video, or for this episode of Vehicles of War Thunder. Before I sign off, I do want to go ahead and remind you all that I have a Discord and Patreon. I highly recommend that you join the Discord if you want to stay updated on what's going on with the channel, because that is my go-to place for posting about any potential interruptions to my recording or streaming schedule, which is something I've gotten into more recently. I don't stream War Thunder largely because I just don't have consistent enough matches that I enjoy that I would want to, you know, do that live. So, because if you've watched pretty much any of the other videos on my channel, you know I am the kind of person who is open to swearing. So, live streaming War Thunder is a terrible idea. Because, like I said, I just don't get consistent enough good matches that are enjoyable to really warrant doing that live. As for the Patreon, if you find yourself enjoying this channel, that is probably the easiest and best way to help support the channel. For as little as $1 a month, you'll get early access to all of my videos, and it also helps me out to being able to produce these Vehicles of War Thunder videos, because, to be honest, some vehicles have premiums, and, you know, I want to be able to cover all variants of a vehicle that are available in-game. So, you know whether or not it's worth getting the premiums, whether the vehicle's good at its BR, or at least whether I think it's good at its BR. Which may not always be accurate because I'm not the best player. I'm really not. I mean, I sometimes get in like the top 3, and when I do that in War Thunder, I realize that my team sucked. The enemies just sucked more because I'm not that great of a player. I'm really not. All things considered, if I'm top of the leaderboard, there's something wrong, is the way I see it. So sometimes I may think a vehicle is terrible, but the reality is it may not actually be the worst vehicle ever. It's just my opinion on how the vehicle performs, which is going to be colored by my experience of using it, which won't always be the best experience, just because of the way War Thunder matchmaking is, particularly with its inconsistency. I'm not quite sure what we'll be covering next. I was potentially leaning towards covering the F-86 Sabre, or at least the American ones, because I don't have the other countries, nor the license-built ones that are in the German and I think French, or maybe Italian trees, or maybe both of them, I'm not quite sure. Either way, I don't have any of the license-built ones. And so, yeah, and the reality is it would be like another year or 2 before I'd unlock any of those other variants, so when I do get around to doing the F-86, those will more than likely get addendum videos for the variants that are in other countries' tech trees. But I should also mention that's sort of being put on the back burner because I'm not really enjoying flying the F2. And that's just partly because of the way, again, Gaijin matchmaking works. The F2 is not a particularly great Saber in my opinion, but it doesn't help when you get regularly up-tiered to 9.7 and 10.0. Which is just hell. You are significantly slower than anything you go up against. It's just not fun. So I don't know what we'll be covering next. I really don't. I've got a number of scripts already written. I just need to record the background video and record the audio. Or, well, I gotta technically finish writing the script by recording the background video, but either way. But yeah, so that'll be it for this video. Like I said, I will see you all next time, but until then, goodbye and farewell.